Before the United States ever entered the war, there were rumors of a mysterious Japanese fighter. Supposedly, it was fast, maneuverable, and unstoppable in the air, dominating the skies over China with a kill ratio of 12-1. At first, it sounded like wartime exaggeration, but very soon, Allied fighter pilots would tell a different story. The Zero became a symbol of Japanese air power at the height of the empire, but the same plane that once shocked the Allies would just a few years later be sent into hopeless one-way missions, written off as expendable. This is the full story of the A6M Mitsubishi Zero, how it terrified Allied pilots, how they learned to beat it, and how this fighter became both Japan's greatest weapon and its painful reminder of what went wrong. Let's set the stage. In the Pacific Theater, having control of the skies was everything. The region stretched across vast oceans and scattered island chains where every supply run, naval convoy, and troop movement depended on air superiority. Whoever controlled the air controlled pretty much everything else. And in the early days of the war, the Japanese Zero had it completely. But Japan's iconic fighter didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the result of a long, deliberate military build-up from the ground up. Back in the late 1800s, Japan was still a feudal society, barely beginning to modernize. But by the early 20th century, it was expanding, using European technology and strategy to reshape itself. It fought and beat Russia, annexed Korea, and took island chains north and south of the home islands, all before the First World War even began. World War I then gave Japan the perfect chance to push further. By siding with the Allies, it seized German positions in the Pacific, now completely cementing its presence across the region and becoming the dominant power. But to hold that influence, Japan poured everything into naval expansion and built the third largest navy in the world, behind only Britain and the United States. Those two had plenty of territory nearby, the Philippines, Hawaii, and Hong Kong. What could possibly go wrong? Conflict wasn't a matter of if, but when. American-made Hawk fighters flown by Chinese pilots were among the first to face the Zero in battle, and they were being just decimated. Then in September 1940, Japan signed a military pact with Germany and Italy. The message was clear: if the United States entered the war in Europe, it would also face war in the Pacific. Washington answered by moving the entire Pacific Fleet from California to Pearl Harbor. You know what happened next. Japan launched a surprise attack, aiming to wipe out the US Navy. Battleships, airfields, and fuel depots were hit in a carefully planned assault meant to knock the United States out before the war in the Pacific even began. And for a moment, it looked like it might work. The Zero entered the Pacific War as a complete shock to the Allies, and pilots quickly realized their own aircraft didn't stand a chance. Intelligence had picked up signs of a new Japanese fighter well before the war started, but nobody quite believed them. A plane faster than a Spitfire, with a range of nearly 2,000 miles, able to land on a carrier and still outmaneuver anything in the air, that sounded like fiction. The common view was that Japanese planes were just cheap copies of outdated Western designs. That underestimation gave Japan a dangerous advantage when war broke out, and by the time the Allies realized their mistake, Japan had already taken the upper hand. The Zero was built with an aluminum alloy frame that made it incredibly agile. It weighed under 2,000 kilograms, but it carried two 20mm cannons in the wings and twin 7.7mm machine guns above the engine. So definitely not something the Allies should have overlooked. It could also fight at high and low altitude and everything in between, and what made it even worse for Allies was the skill of its pilots. Japanese naval aviation didn't churn out thousands of half-trained pilots, at least not at this point in the war. Their cadets went through brutal years-long training, and early on the standards were so high that sometimes only 100 pilots were accepted in an entire year. By the time of Pearl Harbor, those Zero pilots were more than ready and some of the best in the world. They provided fighter escort during the attack, and very few American planes managed to even get off the ground. The ones that did, like the P-36 Hawk and the P-40 Warhawk, were quickly shot down. Over the next few months, Japan went on the offensive across Southeast Asia, spearheaded by the Zero's aggressive tactics. They could outturn and outclimb anything thrown at them, and by this point, the Zero was the most feared aircraft in the Pacific. The standard frontline American fighter at the time was the F-4F Wildcat, a tough but sluggish aircraft compared to the Zero. Pilots very soon realized that if you tried to outturn a Zero, you died. Losses mounted, and the Zero was simply too good to kill in a dogfight. By the summer of 1941, Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch knew that his Wildcat squadron were likely going to face a superior enemy. He hadn't fought the Zero yet, but reports of such encounters made him think. Sitting at a table with matchsticks, using them to simulate dogfight scenarios, he came up with a simple but brilliant idea. He worked out a tactic where two fighters would fly side by side, and when one was being chased, they'd turn in toward each other. The enemy attacking aircraft would then end up directly in the gun sight of the second pilot. That move would become known as the Thatch Weave. Its first real test came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch led a flight of Wildcats tasked with protecting US torpedo bombers. He knew the Zeros would come, and they did. One of Jimmy's wingmen was the first to be tailed, and they executed the Thatch Weave for the first time in real combat. The Zero was hit and broke apart. Another one, pursuing from above, tried to follow, only to get caught in the same trap. The Thatch Weave became the most important tactic in the Pacific for Allied fighters, and versions of it are still taught as basic dogfighting tactics even today. So instead of tight dogfights, the Allies went for speed and altitude. They flew high and dove fast, using so-called boom and zoom tactics that played to the strengths of newer American fighters that were finally catching up. The outclassed F-4F Wildcat was replaced with something far better, the F-6F Hellcat, now with heavier armor, better speed, and far more firepower. One interesting thing is that during the development of the Hellcat, the Allies had a huge stroke of luck that seemed like it came from the gods themselves. Because of that, the Hellcat would earn the nickname the Zero Killer. Here's why. In July of 1942, on remote Akutan Island, a Zero had crash-landed during a Japanese raid on Dutch Harbor. The pilot, trying to make an emergency landing, flipped the plane and died on impact. But the Zero was mostly intact as it had hit the swampy soft ground. For the Americans, this was gold. Until then, no one had ever gotten their hands on a complete Zero. Now they could see exactly what made this thing so deadly. Engineers restored the aircraft and got it flying again. The Zero was light, nimble, and handled beautifully at low speeds. However, they found all its flaws. When pushed at high speeds or in dives, the ailerons would freeze and the frame would start to shake or even break apart. It turned better left than right. It had no armor at all, no self-sealing fuel tanks. To put it simply, it was fast and agile because it was built like paper. The Zero's thin elliptical wings cut drag dramatically, and new German heat treatment processes gave it stronger, lighter aluminum. There were even drilled-out parts of the internal frame to shave off more weight. The skin of the aircraft was barely over 1 millimeter thick in some places. Even the cockpit was designed for the shorter Japanese pilot. The Zero was so fragile that the pilot could damage it just by climbing into the cockpit. There were fold-out footholds and handles built into the fuselage to avoid damaging the thin outer skin. One interesting feature was a special bag in the rear of the plane that could be inflated using redirected air from the engine intake. In theory, it would keep the plane afloat during a crash landing at sea. So Japan actually tried to make it survivable and reusable, yet it would end up being used as a one-way flying bomb in the end. Now all that data was quickly passed on, and the Hellcat, in its final stage of development, was designed specifically to exploit these weaknesses. From that point on, American pilots not only knew how to win, but finally had the aircraft to do it. Alongside the Hellcat came the F-4U Corsair and the P-38 Lightning, both far better armored and armed than the Zero. With the right tactics, they would outdive Japanese fighters and only engage when the situation was in their favor. The Battle of Midway was the turning point, where Japan lost 4 carriers, its best pilots, and the air war began to shift. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, Hellcat pilots tore through Japanese air power. Thousands of Japanese aircraft were shot down in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the Zero, at this point, barely stood a chance. By 1944 and 1945, Japan was still sending pilots into combat in outdated aircraft that simply couldn't keep up. The Japanese Navy had actually asked for a replacement for the Zero as early as 1940, but nothing came. Design teams were tied up with other projects, and Japan's industry was already strained to its limits. The result was delay after delay. Development of the A6M Repu, the long-awaited successor, began in 1942, but its first test flight didn't happen until May of 1944, and by then it was too late. With no replacement and factories strained by shortages, Japan had no choice but to keep sending Zeros into the sky. The pilots flying them were no longer the hardened veterans of 1941. Most of those men were long gone. Their replacements had barely 40 hours of flight training, nowhere near enough to handle a Zero in combat, especially now against experienced American pilots in superior fighters. The results were catastrophic. As the situation worsened and desperation set in, Japan began converting its remaining Zeros into kamikaze aircraft, loading them with 250-kilogram bombs and sending them on one-way missions. In May of 1945, 2 Zeros dove through low cloud cover and slammed into the carrier USS Bunker Hill. Nearly 400 American sailors were killed. But attacks like that were the exception. Most never reached their targets. The war was already lost. A plane that had once ruled the skies was now a symbol of a nation on the edge of collapse, slowly grinding into disappearance. But still, one of the most iconic fighters of the Second World War. If you liked this video, check out our channel for more.